Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you for participating in the series. This is an encore presentation about best practices for monitoring the efficacy and effects of restoration, something that is near and dear to my heart because, of course, we are doing restoration to improve ecological integrity and human well-being. And we're investing quite a lot of resources and time in these restoration practices with the aim of having benefits. And as in this cartoon here, you know, we hope that our kids years down the road will think that our investment was sound and we actually got some benefit. We want the treatments that we implemented today instead of a future where our kids need to go and do additional interventions like removing the tattoo for things we thought were good ideas today. And a way that we can maximize outcomes is to evaluate and adapt what we're doing based on evidence. So in this presentation today, I'm going to talk about 10 reasons why monitoring fail, and then best practices for building or improving upon a monitoring program. As Manu mentioned, I'm a professor at University of Montana, that's in the Western United States. My work is primarily in the area of restoration ecology, both assessing the effects of change, biotic and abiotic change on vegetation, but also squarely in this realm of monitoring the efficacy and effects of treatments. And through that, I've really gotten interested in methods of monitoring. Okay, here we go. So there's a pretty widespread sentiment, I would even say a consensus about the importance of monitoring. And yet we know it's rarely done. This is a little bit of a dated publication, but it's an amazing one. This is from Bernhardt et al. In Science from 2005. And I say it's amazing because it assessed almost 40,000 river restoration projects. And what was found was that only 10% of them included any kind of monitoring. But what was also really interesting is that in order to do effective monitoring, you need to have a project that's designed to allow for effective monitoring. And I'll be talking about that later. But so from these nearly 40,000 projects, most were not designed to actually evaluate effectiveness or to disseminate results. And so, as I mentioned, I want to talk about the top 10 reasons that monitoring fails. One reason I'm not going to talk about is lack of adequate resources, lack of money. I can think of many examples of very well-funded monitoring programs that are not effective for the reasons that I'll be discussing. Not that resources are not important. It absolutely is a limitation. However, I think that limitation is fairly well known. And I want to focus on things that can be addressed through best practice. They clearly link to having the resources to do them. Okay, so reason number one is that monitoring is not included in the project planning stage. So oftentimes we see a project framework, this conventional, I called it here conventional framework, where you have the first step, and that's sort of this tan color here of planning, then in the sort of olivey green color doing, and then the blue color evaluate and respond. So when we are writing or even creating schematics on a page, you're stuck with 2 dimensions. And so there's a need to provide, you know, some kind of order. We see this order, but it communicates that evaluating and responding starts after the doing. And that's a huge problem because unless the plan for monitoring is built into your project plan, you will not have the funding you need to do the monitoring. It won't have been included in your project budget. Similarly, many types of monitoring questions require that you have pre-treatment or baseline data. So unless the monitoring plan is developed enough to the extent that you know the sampling design, the indicators, everything for that baseline data collection, you'll lose the opportunity to answer certain kinds of questions. And I'm going to touch on that later. Similarly, if you have not if you haven't developed your monitoring plan and you don't know all of the elements of your monitoring program project prior to this doing phase, you also won't know how you intend to share results of your monitoring, utilize them, in an adaptive management framework, and you won't have budgeted or thought through or have the staffing to do that piece. A better framework, and I stole this from a US federal document produced by NOAA, I adapted it, is to have the two things, the project design and the monitoring design, go hand in hand. So the blue box in the schematic is everything about planning and implementing your project, and then the sort of green-gray box is everything about planning and implementing your monitoring. And it's meant to show that they should be occurring at the same time. So you start your project design, you start your monitoring plan design, you do your implementation of your project in sort of engineering terms, that's the construction phase. And then you do your implementation monitoring, which is, well, you implement those baseline surveys, you do your as-built. So did the treatment go in as planned? And then after that, you do your post-treatment monitoring, et cetera. But they both happen hand in hand, different than the cycle that we saw. Okay, reason number 2. Monitoring is often viewed as a management activity that has no relationship to science. And I understand why that is, because the products of science, scientific publication advancing the field, are different than the outcomes of management, which are things happening on the ground. However, to ask and answer questions related to treatment impacts, you need to bring in some of the same skills that you bring into a scientific investigation. So I'm going to kind of walk through a couple slides related to that. So first, scientific research. Research is the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to, and this is the important part, one of the important parts, establish facts and reach new conclusions. So what is monitoring? Well, part of the problem is monitoring is very, very broad. So the definition in English from the Oxford English Dictionary is watching, keeping track of, or checking, usually for a special purpose. And this special purpose is something that I want to focus on now. Because there's lots of reasons to monitor. Like you could do surveillance monitoring. For instance, we record the weather. There's no question being asked. There's no hypothesis being tested. It's just checking the weather. Implementation monitoring, again, what happened when the treatments were put in. There's also now quite a lot of emphasis in monitoring in terms of educating stakeholders, which has huge benefits, right? Regardless of whether or not you learn anything about the efficacy or effects of your treatments, by engaging stakeholders in the process of monitoring, it's an opportunity to build trust about the project. In fact, in the United States right now, there's actually a really primary emphasis on monitoring as stakeholder engagement, maybe even just passive monitoring, right? Without trying to understand efficacy or effects. So I've called that educational monitoring. Okay, so all of those, let me go back to my previous bubble, sorry. Okay, so all of those are really different from research, right? We're not trying to establish new facts or answer questions. But there is also question-driven monitoring where we are trying to answer questions about the efficacy and effects of treatments. And in that special purpose, right, of watching, it's actually incumbent upon us, if we want to be able to reliably answer questions, to pull in some of what we know about how to do effective research, like having repeatable observations and reliable ways to test for differences. So thinking monitoring is not related to research, right? And when I say research here, maybe that's jargony, but what I mean is, this systematic, repeatable observations and question-driven monitoring is risky if we're spending money on it, because again, the purpose of doing the monitoring, if it is the purpose, answering questions, unless you take this sort of scientific approach, you may not be able to answer the questions you want to. Now, I want to take a step back and say that I also want to acknowledge that there are all forms of knowledge that can be used and highly important for monitoring. So there are other forms of knowledge, I'm repeating myself, and for instance, traditional ecological knowledge, local knowledge, practitioner experience, all of that can also be used to evaluate the effectiveness of treatments, but I'm zeroing in right now on just the importance of scientific knowledge, and that'll be a theme as I move forward in the presentation. Okay. So reason number 3 that monitoring can fail or be less impactful is about actually your project planning if you don't have clear management objectives. And this particularly is relevant for effectiveness monitoring. So if you want to say, was our project effective at reaching the project goals? It's hard to answer that if you don't have clear project goals. You could still monitor for the effects of treatments. What happened after you implemented the treatments, even if you don't have a single project goal. However, if it's important to your project to know whether it's been successful in meeting goals, you need to have those project goals or objectives. So oftentimes there are objectives in my experience, but they're very vague. So for instance, restore resilience to wildfire. That's the objective of one of the objectives of a project. So think about that. Is this going to be something that after 5 years, you could report whether you were successful? And what I would suggest, and this comes from a great resource from Elzinga, again, adapted from this sort of older document, I would suggest there's 6 different criteria that need to be included in a clear, measurable management objective. And they include this attribute. So that could be resilience, fire severity. It's kind of broad, okay? But then after that, a target. That's actually some people use the indicator. And this should be specific enough that it has units associated with it. Overstory tree crown density, ladder, fuels, okay? Then an action, increase, decrease, or maintain. A quantity or status, what does success look like? You want to decrease fuels by 20%. The time frame, I just put 5 years. And then what geographical location. So objectives that lack one or more of these components may mean it makes it difficult to say, did we achieve what we wanted to in this project, which is effectiveness monitoring. So here's couple examples. I've already said restore resilience to wildfire. It only includes the attribute. It doesn't include anything else. So here's a couple of revised: increase cover of fire adapted native understory vegetation in the treated area by 20% within 5 years, or mitigate fire risk within 5 miles of Seeley Lake by reducing rate of crown fire spread, which would be modeled under extreme weather conditions by 60% in 10 years. And as I'm reading this, I can already see it could be more detailed, like under what is meant by extreme fire weather conditions, 95% extreme fire weather conditions. It could be unpacked a little more. So hopefully that's useful for those of you who are developing restoration plans that you want to link to a monitoring program. Okay, so here we get to the most detailed. I'm going to spend the most time here on reason number 4, and it has to do with experimental designs, and that's even jargony there, but it's really hard to use a different word than experimental design. Again, we're not talking about experimental design for basic knowledge. We're talking about designing your monitoring, your sampling, right, in a way that you're going to be able to answer the question you want to ask. And I want to go through 2 main types of questions that managers are often, and community member stakeholders are often interested in knowing about restoration projects. So question type 1 is, did we reach our performance target, right? And so the jargony way to talk about that is an endpoint assessment. You're really interested in what happened at the end. And in restoration, we can think of this question as, to what extent is the site restored? I'm going to come back to both of these questions in a minute. The second type of question is, did the management activity, our actions on the landscape, have an effect? And the jargony way to say that, you don't even really need to know it, but an effect size assessment. And that's effects monitoring. So in my title, I said efficacy and effects, and I meant them, as these 2 sorts of questions. The reason this is so important is that when you need to sample and where you need to sample varies based on which of those questions you want to answer. So if you look just in the gray box, right, the different approaches to sampling or data requirements for sampling include having the baseline data, the pre-treatment data, having data after treatment, okay? Whether or not you need to have data from a control site. What's a control site? A control site is a site that's like your project site, that's degraded, but that's not going to get any treatment. So that's the control. The control is degraded. Whether or not you need performance targets or those management objectives that I mentioned, and then whether or not you need information from reference sites and ideally a reference model. And again, the reference is different from the control sites. So control sites are degraded sites that are like the sites that you're doing the activities in, degraded in the same way and to the same extent, but that you're not treating. The reference model is a model that characterizes the condition your project area would have been in if degradation hadn't occurred. Okay, so that's this gray column. I've now explained it. In the colored columns, in the headers, I've put different questions. Does the treated area, your project site, did you meet your performance target? To what extent is it restored? And so those are all my type 1 questions. To what extent did the management activity result in an effect? What was the effect? And I'm going to unpack these a little more and then revisit this graph in the end. But why I'm spending so much time on this is to say, unless you have a clear sense of what you want to learn, you won't know when and where you need to collect data. When meaning pre or post-treatment, where meaning just your treated sites, control sites, reference sites. Okay, so now that's sort of my long introduction. I'm gonna roll through them again. So question 1, did we reach our performance target? And I already said this jargony endpoint assessment, but really what you're doing here is you're comparing the state of your project area, your system, after treatment with whatever you set as your goal. So your predefined goal. And so what you need to get started in doing this type of an assessment is you need your performance target, those pre-assigned goals. And so those can be theoretical. You made them up, you know, you're a knowledgeable person about the system, and you think the ecology, human benefits would be improved, or ecological integrity and benefits would be improved by having 90% vegetation cover rather than, you know, 20% erosion is a problem, right? So you pick that. The second I've labeled empirical, and that's you have data. So we're talking about restoration right now. So for the special case of ecological restoration, you would be trying to achieve the reference condition, and you would have data from your reference model about what that target should be. So maybe you want to achieve 90% of the reference condition. Okay, the condition the system would have been in if it hadn't been degraded. But either way, however you're getting that, you know, objective for your project, you are comparing the treatment post-intervention with the stated goal. And I want to give you some examples. This is one of my favorite papers. It's by David Moreno-Mateos and colleagues. It is about the effectiveness of wetland restoration, and it's a meta-analysis. They had like 600 wetland projects. And so this is an endpoint assessment where they're comparing what happened in these restoration projects after treatment, right? What was the result, and how does that relate to their reference model or their reference system? And so you can see time in years, that's on the x-axis. It goes out to 100 years, right? So clearly they didn't have, you know, they weren't able to collect pre-treatment information. I suppose it could have existed, but they didn't need it to create this response ratio, because it's just whether or not they achieved the reference condition. So full reference condition is up on this 0 line. There's multiple traces. So they looked at vertebrates, macroinvertebrates, and plants. Because they were looking at 600 studies, the actual metric varied, but they were able to determine the proportion of the reference for each of these studies for each of these indicator variables. And so what you can see is that took the longest time for plants to recover. That's the green trace. It was about 30 years to get to about 90% of the reference. Whereas the vertebrates were, you know, with these error bars right around reference after about 10 years. Another example, hopefully many of you have seen this, is from the Society for Ecological Restoration's Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. In the standards, there is a great explanation of this, what's called the recovery wheel. And it lists 6 different categories of attributes that could be used to assess the efficacy of a restoration project or a success of a restoration project. And so if you look on this left wheel that I'm spinning my mouse around, this would be the baseline condition. And the attributes are species composition, structural diversity, ecosystem function, external exchanges, which also is a bit jargony, but this has to do with connectivity. So the context, the landscape context of your project area, connectivity to other ecosystems, but also subsidies into the ecosystem as well. And then threats, physical conditions. So on the left here, we've shown the baseline where it's been noted the percent of reference. The outer edge of this wheel is the reference condition. And so in this case, it's a level 4 for water chemistry, and it's a level, 3 or star 3 in the SCR framework for recovery for desirable plants. The response ratio that I just showed you is very similar. It just quantifies this based on percent, right? So for instance, you could consider this as percent going out to 100 or proportion. Okay, probably belabored that for too long, but then 10 years later, you can see the difference. If you want to ask how successful is my restoration, you want to tell your stakeholders, you could say for each of these variables, the percentage of reference you've achieved at the end of your project. Again, the data you need is data from your project area and that reference model. Okay, I feel like there was one other thing I wanted to say, but I can't think of it. So, oh, I know what it is. This is taking, I'm going to use another jargony term, a univariate approach, right? A single variable approach. So you would say, we're just like on the previous graphic, we're this for vertebrates, we're this for plants, univariate. There are ways to work in with multivariate metrics to have a sort of single unit of comparison with your reference model. I don't have time to talk about that here, but I did just want to mention that. Okay, so I spent all of that time unpacking this sort of, effectiveness approach, primarily because I wanted to get at this question. Can this endpoint assessment, just looking after, tell you if your treatment was effective? And actually, it really can't. And I have a series of slides now to show why that is. Okay, so the endpoint assessment, it answered the question, did we reach our goal or did we reach our objective, right? However, they don't establish a causal relationship between what happened on the site and your goal. Okay, so if that's important to you, you want to say, was it worth it to seed? Or maybe we would have had the same result if we hadn't seeded just from natural dispersal, right? If you want to ask, was it what we did that made the difference, right? You need to establish that causal relationship. So the question isn't the state of the system after compared to before, but rather the state of the system after your treatment compared to if the restoration hadn't happened. And I want to talk about how you design that. So oftentimes people want to know what happened after a treatment. They will do a before-after design, right? You look before, you look after. You compare measurements between those two time periods. That seems like that should work, right? But there's a substantial problem about that when we're working with plants and animals and ecosystems. And that's because ecosystems are dynamic, they always change over time. The vegetation changes, wildlife populations change, right? And so if you look before and after, part of what you're measuring will be just background levels of change. And I want to give an example. This is a field of Bromus tectorum near where I live. This is an invasive grass. It's highly problematic in grassland ecosystems all through the Western United States. Okay. I could do a project with my students. I could sample the abundance, the biomass of cheatgrass, or let's say cover. I could go and sample the cover of cheatgrass, and I could do an excellent study. I could put out 1,000 plots, right? 1 by 1 meter plots in cheatgrass. I could have my students go and measure the cover. And then I could do a treatment. And I'm going to say a treatment that all of you will hopefully think is ridiculous. So my treatment is going to be going out and yelling at the cheatgrass to go away. So we're going to measure the cover, and then I'm going to have all my students go and yell at the cheatgrass to go away. And we're going to come back the next year and we're going to measure the cover again. 1,000 plots, very, very well replicated. Well, as it turns out, I bet we will find differences in cover, and I bet they will actually be statistically significant if we bothered to test it. And why is that? Well, this is just a schematic, Palmer Drought Severity Index. Okay, so it integrates, environmental factors like precipitation with plant responses. But anyway, and you can see here that we've got wet years and dry years. Every year is really different, right? There's, a cycle of wet years, but they're not exactly the same. Some are wetter than others, and then dry years, there's wet years after dry years. And so the abundance of cheatgrass, the cover of cheatgrass, is going to vary based on which year you're measuring. And so because of that, if I measure before and after, I'm going to see a difference. It may have nothing to do with my treatment. So we have entirely confounded the treatment effect with background changes over time. Okay, I've just said this, confounds treatment effects with year-to-year variation, temporal variation. Okay, we can also measure on control impact. The control are the sites that didn't get treated, the impact are the sites that get treated. This is another really common design because you didn't start your monitoring before your treatment. So you're left after treatment, you can go in and you can measure in your treated sites, and you can measure in control sites and hope then that you'll be able, now you don't have this issue with background changes over time, right? However, you have a different issue. And the issue that you have is that there's a high degree of variability, stand to stand within a forest or site to site within all, wetlands, all kinds of ecosystems. This is data I don't want to spend too much time on, but it's actually from years ago during my dissertation, which is where I really learned this lesson hard. This schematic here shows the frequency in percentage of these different plants. So along the x-axis, it's the genus, first couple letters, genus, first couple letters of the species. There's a picture of some of these plants in this system. This is Western United States, very beautiful forest. And the bars, the dark blue bar is areas that were scheduled for retention to be no impact. And then the blue, the kind of brighter blue, are areas that were scheduled to be treated, okay? But this is before treatment. No treatments have occurred. And you can see, oh, and what's the sample size? There were 16. I had 16 of each of these. And so you can see there's huge differences in where these species are located prior to treatment. Let's say my treatment had no effect, like my ridiculous treatment. I'm going to go yell at plants, right? I would come in after and say, oh, look at this. This rose species is really affected by harvest, but that's not the place. And so I found that nearly a quarter of species with a sample size of 16, I would have had found significant effects just in terms of differences between these areas that were scheduled for different things to happen. Okay, we're winding down here on this part. Okay, so the problem with just looking at control or impact is you're confounding site to site or spatial variation with your treatment effects. So the best way to reliably answer the question is to have a before-after control impact design where you're comparing your measurements made before to those made after treatments in both control and treated sites. And the variable you're analyzing is change pre to post-treatment in your control and your treated sites. And I've got this schematic, which is from Elzinga et al. 2001, and I've modified it. And it just goes through doing no monitoring. Let's say your treatment was a prescribed burn. In this case, if you just checked after, of course, you haven't learned anything, you could look before and after, but again, you can't infer anything because it could be background changes. So you need to do before, after control impact, but of course it needs to be replicated. And so this gray shaded box shows the best design. If you have funding, you can answer the question, what effects did our intervention have? Okay, It's also good to replicate over time. We often think about replicating over space, but not over time, because when you ask a question, what was the effect of my treatment? It's important to remember you're getting an answer for the year that you did that you asked the question. And so it could be that that was the driest year or the wettest year. Okay, so I'm going to move on quickly, but which of these questions you want to answer, just to summarize, does the treated area meet the performance target? You don't need pre-treatment data. You do need post-treatment. You don't need controls. You need your performance targets. In all the way in the green, to what extent did the management activity result in an effect? Then you need pre, post, control. You don't necessarily need to have a reference model. That's not going to come into answering that question. All right. On to reason number 5, lack of reliable data. So this is something in monitoring, you need to make sure that you're not having a lot of observer bias in your estimations, because of course the people doing the monitoring will change over time. And so some projects don't have adequate field instructions. I've put up a figure here to think about something coarse woody debris. This is Western forest, the wood on the forest floor, really hard to accurately measure, just to get you thinking about things in different systems. So what I find interesting is often there is an adequate explanation. We don't have these actual field instructions. This is from the US Forest Service. It's very, very detailed field instructions. But there's something else that's needed besides the field instructions, which is besides like the field codes descriptions of all the variables, right? And what they mean and what you're supposed to write down, is you actually need a real cookbook to walk you through each step of the process. And I want to just give a quick example. This is a lot of text, but I wanted you to see how detailed this entry is in this US Forest Service document, right? So for tree damage, you're going to write down a category of damage, and then there's codes for each of the different ones. But in order to reduce observer error, you need more than this. So this is the first step. Then you need to direct who's ever observing how much time to spend at the tree. Because if you don't specify that, someone who's really interested in finding, in this case, insects and diseases, may spend 20 minutes and write down different codes than someone who spent 5 minutes. So this is a huge problem in monitoring, needing to have all of these detailed codes and then explanations of the actual methods for when you're at the site, getting information, making decisions that are going to be made in the same way over time. Reason number 6. So monitoring, you're comparing over time, often, not always, because of course there's the endpoint assessment, but oftentimes it's a goal of a project to ask and answer questions about trends over time. And so in order to do that, future people, managers, stakeholders are going to need to be able to access the information that you obtained from the current monitoring. And so in order to do that, we really need to pay attention to not just having all the information in the right places in our databases, so clean databases, but also having what's called metadata documentation. So that's jargony, but it's like a legend to your whole database. So appropriate metadata documentation will give anyone in the future all the information they need to understand every single cell in your database. And in addition, you should have documentation that explains as a legend overall to all the files in your project. And then data archiving, making sure you have archived it in a way that people will find it. There's great publicly available archives now. Reason number 7 is lack of a data analysis plan. This is critically important to do when you're developing your monitoring plan at the project planning stage for many reasons. One of them is that if you don't have a data analysis plan, when it comes time to analyze your data, you may realize you didn't collect variables that were important or you didn't have enough replication. Secondly, is if you don't have a data analysis plan, you may not have designated anyone to do that data analysis. You may not have funding for that data analysis piece. And so your monitoring program will result in, I've put files here, it's old school, but digital files that haven't been analyzed and you don't actually get to answer the question that you did the monitoring for. Okay, reason number, so just, an example here of one way you might want to analyze data. Okay, we'll skip that. Reason number 8, lack of a communication plan. So again, prior to project initiation, prior to finishing your restoration plan, it's helpful to have a monitoring plan that says not just how you're going to generate a story, meaning the data analysis part, but how are you going to share your results and who is it important to share to? Maybe for your team, it's only important to share with local stakeholders, or maybe you're a business and it's only important to share with your team to apply to future projects. Or maybe it's important to share globally. And so I've put up, 2 very different approaches to sharing. One is meeting with stakeholders and sharing results in a meeting in the field. The second is loading your results so your story can be shared internationally. And there's several different great databases right now. I've just put up a clip from the FIRM registry, the Framework for Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring. So think about that as you're developing your monitoring program. That communication piece should be built at the outset. Reason number 9, lack of assessment of the efficacy, not of the treatments, of the monitoring program itself. How is your monitoring program doing in terms of its ability to ask and answer questions? That is extremely important, because if your design, you're undersampling, you don't have reliable data, you won't be able to answer the questions. We've talked about that. However, if you're oversampling, you'll be able to answer your questions. That's good, but you will have wasted a lot of resources. And I've learned this sort of the hard way. I'm going to show a ton of data here from a really exciting river restoration project, really big. It's actually one super fund project in the US. So that's funded to reduce contamination, where a giant river was moved, floodplain revegetated. And I've put arrows to direct you what I want you to look at. So this floodplain includes lots of different habitat types, right? And when I first started doing this monitoring, I stratified. I had the same number of plots per type. We're looking just here in the column herbaceous cover, right? So colonizing depositional, that's one habitat type. I had 34 replicates. This is in my latter years of sampling. I was able to get within 24% of the actual value of herbaceous cover with my 34 samples. But in the wetlands, I only did 8 samples. I got within 18% of the actual mean cover with fewer samples. And so it's really important to evaluate how you're doing with respect to your sample size, your indicators, everything about the program, so you can adjust it, so you can put every dollar that you have to the best use in your restoration project. All right, reason number 10. This isn't really its own reason. It's sort of a synthesis of all the things I've already said, is that your monitoring is done in the context of just thinking like a data collection plan rather than a program. And I should have put a citation here. This is from a chapter that I recently wrote for an IUCN publication on the red list of ecosystems and monitoring changes in ecosystem status. If people email me, I can send you links to some of the things I've showed today. Usually I'm in the chat for those of you who are repeat participants, putting in links and doing other stuff, but it's beyond my skill level to talk and type in the chat. So anyway, your effective monitoring program is having those objectives, questions, data collection, then data management, the analysis part, doing the technology transfer, and then assessing your program. And I want to mention too that the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has been working on providing, summarizing best practices, and recently released a summary report on standards of practice to guide ecosystem restoration. It has a monitoring section. The full version of the standards are going to be published in September of 2023. They are currently undergoing Indigenous peoples consultation to ensure that we have adequately represented that all types of knowledge in all parts of the restoration process, as well as the needs of Indigenous and local communities. So that's very important. Again, I didn't focus on that aspect today, including within monitoring, but I don't want to negate its importance. I'm mentioning the summary report because I wanted to say that in the bits on monitoring and evaluation, it's unpacked best practices, so steps for a lot of the things I've talked about today. And here's a schematic from the document in terms of the organization of that section. Okay, that was a lot. Thank you for listening, and we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So hopefully some of the things that I mentioned resonated with you and your monitoring programs.
Thank you very much, Cara. We do have a couple of questions. So the first question would be, can you say that the lack of data is an indication of unplanned monitoring in itself?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll say that I think the lack of data is due to the fact that people haven't, when they plan their restoration, thought through the data that they need, the funding that they need to get the data. And then secondly, I would say that there's actually sometimes more data than you think, because I feel like as like a global restoration culture, people do think we need, understand the uncertainties of restoration, and are bought into the idea that we should be checking, assessing our actions, our activities to see if they're working. So people are ferreting away all of this data, but maybe not analyzing it, or maybe not even sharing the fact that there is data. I've had a couple recent experiences this year working with managers in the US where I find out there's all this information sort of tucked away. I don't think I answered the question.
No, it's completely fine. Let's go to another question, which is very interesting. It talks about the necessity of assessing results in terms of finances and other kind of resources. And we wonder how we can translate the indicators that we use, for example, what you mentioned in reason 8 or reason 9, into those kind of results. How do we link ecological, socio-ecological results directly into finance or any kind of resources results?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think there's sort of two different dimensions of that question. One is specifically having socioeconomic, cultural indicators, and that's about, what are the results for humans and their well-being, right? And ensuring that we're including those kinds of indicators in our projects. And the standards of practice that I mentioned, we spent, and I was one of the co-authors of many authors, 20 co-authors on the document, 18 different organizations spearheaded by the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And just want to acknowledge the Best Practices Task Force of the Decade, which is led by FAO, IUCN, and SER, were the sort of coordinators of the project, but many, many organizations participated. There's a big emphasis to not just talk about doing projects to improve ecological integrity, not just focus there, but doing projects with strong objectives that are socioeconomic and cultural. And then again, in monitoring whether those outcomes are achieved. So that's one dimension. But the second dimension, I think, of the question is a financial, an assessment of whether the project was efficiently run in the financial aspects across all of the implementation of the project, as well as the monitoring. And I talked a bit about that, assessing the efficacy of your monitoring program so you're not wasting money. We do include in the standards a bit about implementation monitoring, including monitoring the costs that were spent so that you can adaptively manage your projects to make sure they're being, with the financial aspect, being run as efficiently as possible. So that would come into your implementation monitoring of your project. Did that answer the question, Gwendolyn?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We do have a couple more. Actually, we have a lot more, but for time reasons, we have to cut into the questions a little bit. A very easy one. Do you think that, yeah, it's easy. It's easy. You'll see. Do you think that applying inadequate monitoring timelines is a common mistake?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad the person raised that issue. Most frequently, I see that monitoring occurs in the first, second, and third year after a project, but not over long time frames. But actually, what we really want to know is not the effect of your restoration action 1 year after, but over the long term. If we spend all of our monitoring resources in that short term, we may not have the opportunity to ask the question over time. So I think, it's always a balance. Feedback we got in the monitoring section in the standards of practice was to specify a time period, but it's really hard to do. We did a global consultation, we got over 2,000 comments, and some people said you should specify that short term is 2 years and long term is more than 20 years. It really depends on the indicator variables that you're using. Oftentimes it is important to check right after treatment, and that gets into to determine if you need, well, one is for implementation monitoring, so you know if the treatment got applied correctly or as prescribed, but also so that you can see if you need to do different ongoing maintenance activities. So that's important very soon after treatment. But then project stakeholders need to consider when they, if they want to invest in the short term, or maybe they want to invest, at the 5 or 10 year point. And I realize there's all kinds of project management and budgeting implications. Oftentimes, if there's a funder involved, you don't get your money till you've completed the project. And if that monitoring is open, you may not be able to close, that contract.
Thank you very much for that very detailed answer. Another question that we have is, what do we need to be on the lookout for when using other people's data?
That's another great question. So many times people will send sort of summary data, right? Means for plots and whatnot. It's helpful if you can get the raw data, and then you can check. I showed a table, I only spent a little bit of time on it, where I checked my precision of estimation with values from my assessment to see how my sampling design was working. And Oftentimes when I'm working with managers, I'll hear like, oh, I haven't taken statistics in so many years, or, oh, it seems like you might need to have advanced training to do this. But the math is really, really simple. You could do all of it on a cell phone with just a little bit of training. So I think it is important to evaluate the effectiveness of any data that you have before you just start using it. So, for example, well, I won't even give an example. I'll just stop there.
Great. And one last question that is a little bit more complex, let's say. Do you think that we are learning from our mistakes? Are we making any progress? Have we managed to fix some of the issues that you mentioned? Are we mostly repeating them, or are we creating new ones in terms of monitoring?
That's a great question. I am an optimist, and I feel like we are moving in the right direction. I feel like I started my presentation with a paper from 2005, of almost 40,000 projects where only 10% of them had any form of monitoring. I think we have a greater percentage today. I think we've had a cultural change within the field of restoration in terms of this sort of consensus on the importance of monitoring. And so now I think more attention, more guidance on how we can do effective monitoring for all different kinds of projects with big budgets, projects with small budgets. I do think there is more attention and more knowledge about some of the problems and effectiveness of treatments over the last, couple of decades. And I think we're going to see over the next decade a huge improvement in developing the database that we need. And I have been very impressed with the activities of all the different task forces of the UN decade in bringing people together, creating a common lexicon, creating shared resources. I mentioned one database for monitoring, but the UN decade, through the best practices task forces, bringing together multiple different platforms. So people are aware of all of the different options. So I think we're moving in the right direction.